When Charles II's crown was restored, he promised not to seek vengeance. He lied. Picture this. For the very first time, England has executed its own king. First, they arrest him for treason, and then they behead him. And he's your father. You go into exile for a decade, only to have your former enemies invite you back to his place as the next monarch. That was the dangerous situation that Charles II faced when he became King of England, and the tragedy didn't stop there. As king, Charles I didn't make life easy for himself, and, as an eventual result, made things terribly difficult for his son. By the time of his son's birth in 1630, he was already on thin ice. The king had given up many of his rights in order to make nice with the pesky English Parliament, and get more of their money. Sadly, it wouldn't be enough to prevent his dark fate. Charles II wasn't the first of his name. His parents had named their first son Charles as well, but he'd passed on shortly after birth. The people expected the king and queen to produce another heir for the House of Stuart. Charles II came along soon afterward, and 7 others followed, most of whom made it to adulthood. His parents were quite talented at bearing heirs. Charles II would not have the same luck, and it would have dire consequences. Things had been tense after Charles II's birth, but as he grew up, his father and Parliament reached a kind of peace. But then, it all fell apart in an instant. Many rulers in history have believed in the divine right to rule, meaning that God alone gives them the right to rule and that they do not have to answer to any earthly power. Charles I believed this, but British Parliament didn't agree, and in 1642, it came to a head. That year, the English Civil War broke out with the 2 warring factions, the Royalists and the Parliamentarians. Charles I knew that he was in trouble. He sent many family members away to France, where his wife's brother was king, but not all of them. He kept his son, Charles II, right by his side, where the young boy witnessed bloody battles and violent campaigns. The king even made Charles II commander of English forces in the West Country at the age of just 14, but the boy couldn't stay out of harm's way forever. Soon the tides changed, and the Royalists began to lose ground. Fearing for his son and heir's life, Charles I made a heartbreaking decision. He sent Charles II, then 16 years old, on the long journey to France, where he'd find safety with his mother and her family. It was a wise decision, as things were about to get way worse. Eventually, Charles II made his way to Netherlands, and during his time there, he began an affair with a woman named Lucy Walter. Soon after, she became pregnant and they had a son together. While illegitimate, Charles II nevertheless showered his son with titles. This was just the beginning of a lifetime of scandalous affairs for Charles II, but this one in particular would come back to bite him later on. The king had done everything in his power to hold on to the throne, but he'd been defeated. His opponents put him on trial for treason, claiming that he'd used his power for personal interest instead of the good of the country. King Charles continued to claim that he had absolute power until they removed him from the court, and days later, sentenced him to beheading. Charles II's fight was over. For now. At this point, Charles II had not seen his father for 15 months. He was still living with a target on his head. If he were to return to England, things would have gotten exponentially worse. Sadly, this meant that he never got to say a goodbye to his father. However, in the king's final moments, Charles I did have a heartbreaking farewell with 2 of his children, Henry and Elizabeth, and he gave them a grave warning. The king couldn't save himself, but he begged his younger son Henry to not let the government make him a puppet king. He knew that all of his children were in danger, especially Charles II, but also Henry was the only one in captivity. Shortly afterward, on January 30th, 1649, Charles I became the first English king to be executed. The tragic event made Charles II a boy without a father and an heir without a throne. The next years of his life were absolutely dire. The king's execution sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Such a dark transgression against one of their own should have compelled rulers and statesmen to back up Charles II, but no such luck. They tiptoed around the subject, sending half-hearted messages of sympathy to Charles II that dared not even mention his claim to the throne. He felt the bitterness of it all rise in his veins, and eventually it would all come violently pouring out. Before his execution, Charles I had won Scotland over to the royalist cause. and when those Scots found out what happened in London, they weren't exactly pleased. To shoot back at England, they named Charles II the King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland. But there was a twist. You'd think that making someone king would also mean you'd welcome them with open arms, but not in 17th century Scotland. No, they had some conditions in mind for Charles II before they'd let him step foot on their soil. They wanted him to propose Presbyterianism across Britain and Ireland, and considering most of his kingdom didn't believe he was their ruler anyway, he was not exactly into pleasing them. This was his first mistake. Instead of capitulating to their demands, Charles II sent in his best general. In return, they got him a gruesome surprise. The Scots quickly captured and executed said general. Without much of a foot to stand on, Charles II agreed to their conditions and traveled to Scotland. This deal didn't exactly make him popular with the English, but he had bigger problems. Sure, the English Parliament had been the driving force behind the English Civil War and his father's execution, but there was one figure leading them to that bloody conclusion, and his name was Oliver Cromwell. And even though he'd vanquished Charles I, he wasn't done with the Stuart dynasty yet. He now had his eyes set on Charles II and the Scottish forces who were backing him up. When Charles capitulated to the Scottish demands for Presbyterianism, he'd felt like he was making a deal with the devil. Then, Cromwell's forces came for him and his allies, and ultimately defeated the Scottish at the Battle of Dunbar. Charles II was in his most disadvantageous position yet, and it was about to get worse. The Scottish forces splintered into two factions. Again, this left Charles in a less than desirable situation. The Scots had split into those with a hankering for some of that sweet Presbyterianism and simple royalists who just missed having a king to stand behind. Charles II picked the easy side and tried to escape to join the royalists. Once again, he picked wrong. They recaptured him and forced him to admit that Presbyterian or not, they were his best hope at restoration. They crowned him King Charles II on New Year's Day in 1651, but there was still that little matter of Cromwell and the Brits. Now united, Charles II and the Scottish forces made a chilling realization. If they wanted to get anywhere, they had to bring their fury right to Cromwell's door. There was just one problem. The numbers of supporters for Charles II were quickly waning. Regardless, they moved forward. Sadly, they met brutal defeat once again, and on English soil, which left their king in grave danger. It was Charles II's first return to England since before his father's execution, but just as soon as it began, it was over. Charles was now in enemy territory, and he had no choice but to make a truly harrowing escape. As the parliamentary forces came for him, he narrowly avoided them by exiting through the back door of the very building they were entering. For his next move, he came up with a chilling plan. The safe move would have been to retreat to Scotland, but instead, Charles II wanted to go straight to London, right in the eye of the storm. Call it harebrained or whatever else you want, but there's one thing we've got to admit. What followed was an epic adventure worthy of an episode of Game of Thrones, or 3. Over the next 6 weeks, Charles II and his small group of officers traveled through England, and he went to great lengths not to be recognized. With their enemies hot on their tails, Charles II and his remaining entourage came up with a plan. The king would go to France, and to get there, they'd spirit him away to the seaport in Bristol. They enlisted the help of every ally that they could along the way, while one of his men, Lord Wilmot, created a distraction by flaunting his presence, undisguised, a few miles ahead of the party. Together, they made it to Bristol, and then to Paris, where he reunited with his mother. At this point, both France and the Netherlands chose to ally themselves with Cromwell and his government. Once again, Charles felt the harsh sting of betrayal. This time, he turned to Spain for support and shelter. They were at odds with France, and now, so was he. They agreed to support his claim to the English crown if he'd raise an army to take on France. He wasn't ready to stop fighting yet, but he had no idea what he was facing. Charles II gathered a ragtag crew of men to join the Spanish in battle, only to face a horrific defeat at the hands of the allied French and British. It was a crushing blow, but then a shocking twist of fate changed everything in an instant. In 1658, Oliver Cromwell fell ill and passed on. While they'd moved away from a monarchy, England didn't quite get the whole democratically elected leader thing yet. Oliver Cromwell had named his son Richard as his successor, so they just kind of went with it, at least at first. Oliver Cromwell had spent time in Parliament and even more time leading an army, whereas his son Richard had done neither of those things. With few allies and little experience, he lasted about a year before he resigned. There was also an election to replace members of Parliament for the first time in 2 decades. Suddenly, it looked like the tide was turning in Charles II's favor. Parliament promised him the crown, but with a very specific set of conditions. He had to swear to work in cooperation with Parliament, offer religious tolerance, and ignore the transgressions performed against him by his opponents. Finally, more than a decade after they'd executed his father, the Parliament invited Charles II to return to England. They would finally proclaim him king, and that wasn't all. They agreed that he'd rightfully been king since his father's beheading, effectively erasing the previous 11 years from history. As we mentioned earlier, Charles II had sired his first child way back when he was just 19 years old. The mother was a woman named Lucy Walter. After he ended their affair, her reaction was utterly bone-chilling. She spread rumors that her and Charles had secretly wed, hoping to establish a claim to the throne for her illegitimate son. Charles didn't seem to care. He had moved on in a big way. When he was in Paris, he romanced one of his mother's maids of honor. She bore him a daughter, and he didn't stop there. When he moved back from Paris to the Netherlands, Charles took up with another lady, having another 2 kids with her in quick succession. Charles II did try to help his children, giving the boys titles and positions in the military, and making sure his daughters married well. He would go on to sire approximately 14 other children illegitimately, but the relationships didn't always go as smoothly. While Charles II clearly loved his bachelor lifestyle, his subjects expected the king to have a queen by his side. The Queen of Portugal arranged for her eldest daughter, Catherine of Braganza, to be sent to England to wed the king. In return, Portugal provided him with an embarrassment of riches. At the time, Portugal was in conflict with Spain, and they really needed the English at their side. In return for Catherine, Charles II received a bunch of territories, the ability to conduct business in Portugal, and a huge monetary payout. When their so-called honeymoon was over, Catherine was in for a rough awakening. Soon enough, the king was back to his old ways, forcing Catherine to face the truth of the situation. Around the time of his coronation, Charles II became involved with the beautiful young daughter of a loyalist family, Barbara Palmer. While England had exiled him, her family had secretly celebrated his birthday each year, believing him to be the true king. She was married when they met. Still, they began a flaming hot affair that lasted over a decade and had its fair share of sweet highs and disturbing lows. Catherine had 2 major factors working against her: her childlessness and her Catholicism. Eventually, Charles II's royal advisors approached him with a proposal. They said that he should divorce her and find a woman who didn't possess those apparently horrible characteristics. His reply made their blood run cold. He knew there was merit to their suggestion, but he outright refused and continued to do so in the years that followed, even as his courtiers began to harass and target her. However, don't let that one anecdote fool you into thinking he was a kind husband. In 1662, while Charles II and Catherine were on their honeymoon, his chief mistress, Barbara Palmer, gave birth to a son. He was ecstatic and wanted to thank her. However, the way he did it was utterly cold-blooded. Charles II gave Palmer a new title as Lady of the Bedchamber, but not the bedchamber you'd think. The title actually meant that she became his wife's chief lady-in-waiting. When Charles II told Catherine, she fainted on the spot. It was the ultimate betrayal. It wasn't only affairs that caused trouble for Charles II. In 1665, he faced the greatest problem of his reign. It was the year that the Great Plague broke out in London. The epidemic had slowly crept to England from Europe, and despite measures taken to prevent it, it soon ran rampant, taking the lives of up to 7,000 people per week. When summer hit, it was a full-blown horror show. In July of 1665, the plague was at its worst. Charles II, his family, and his court all fled London, as did pretty much everyone else who had the financial means to do so. London was a ghost town, populated only by the poor who didn't have the resources to flee. As the month went on, the number waned, but the danger was still there. In February of 1666, the king finally returned to London. Taking his lead, many others followed. and slowly but surely, things began to get back to normal. There were still cases here and there, but soon enough the disease would be completely eradicated, all for a disturbing reason. With the outbreak of the Great Plague, London had known fear, but soon the city would know complete and utter catastrophe. In the autumn of 1666, just as life was getting back to normal in London, tragedy struck. Shortly after midnight on September 2nd, a fire started in a bakery. Quickly, it began to spread and to push north into the heart of the city, and the reaction was chilling. People began to turn on each other and spread rumors that the fire had been set by French and Dutch immigrants. As the fire continued to spread, firefighters were completely overwhelmed. There had been a distinctly anti-royalist sentiment in London through Charles I's reign, and the people there hadn't exactly warmed to Charles II either. When the fire broke out, he offered the mayor help and to send his men in, but wanting to maintain the city's independence, he refused. As a result, the fire was much worse than it should have been. Over the next several years, Charles II slept around with numerous women. The scandals and constant melodrama that followed Charles II around like a bad stench were finally taking their toll. It had been at least 5 years since the Queen's last pregnancy had ended in a miscarriage, and Charles II's subjects grew worried about the question of an heir. All of his children were illegitimate, and his brother was Catholic. The idea of a Catholic king was a huge deal breaker for them. Soon, an English priest began to spread conspiracy theories that the Catholics were attempting to assassinate the king and install one of their own as a successor, in what is called the Popish Plot. Soon, a wave of anti-Catholic hysteria swept people up, despite the fact that the conspiracy was unfounded. While Charles II and his men remained skeptical, the Parliament totally bought into it. They were ready to start a war with France over it. Charles actually conspired with France to prevent this, and when the Parliament accused one of his men of treason as a result, he dissolved the Parliament. It was a Hail Mary move, and it didn't exactly work out in his favour. The new Parliament wasn't any more receptive to working with Charles II. In fact, they were openly hostile. Since his opponents weren't gaining any ground in Parliament, they took their plans out onto the streets. Originally, the Protestants had feared a fake conspiracy to assassinate the king. Now, they were the group planning a real one. In 1683, a group of Protestants conspired to take out both Charles II and his pesky Catholic brother, heir James, in one fell swoop. They planned to ambush the king and his brother as the pair returned from watching horse races. But then, a sudden twist of fate saved Charles II's life. That week, a fire destroyed most of Newmarket, and as a result, the town subsequently cancelled the races. Charles II's survival had been a complete stroke of luck, but his trouble didn't end there. On February 2nd, 1685, Charles II began to suffer from an apoplectic fit. For the next 4 days, he rested, taking time to speak to his brother and his wife, and to ensure that his favorite mistresses would be taken care of. Charles II's final days were absolutely torturous. In order to try and cure him, doctors subjected him to a number of primitive, gruesome, and painful treatments, including bloodletting, purging, and cupping. When Charles II realized that his chances of recovery were slim, he made his peace with those that he could. He even apologized to his wife for the way that he treated her over the years. In his final moments, Charles II stunned many, especially his wife, when he returned to the Roman Catholic faith. He called for a priest to give him his last rites. Then, at the age of 54, he passed on. As we'll remember, back when Charles II became king, the Parliament forced him to pardon many of his old enemies, but he did get to subject some of the men involved in his father's execution to brutal punishments. However, his number one enemy, Oliver Cromwell, escaped this dark fate. He passed on 3 years before Charles II came to power. However, if you think this means that he escaped Charles II's thirst for bloody vengeance, you'd be wrong. For his part in overthrowing the English monarchy and the execution of Charles I, the king subjected Cromwell to a posthumous execution on January 30th, 1661. Charles II had his men dig up his body, as well as other commanders involved with the execution, hang it in chains in London, and then throw it into a pit for good measure. As if Charles II's message didn't come across with that, he also had Cromwell's severed head on a pole outside of Westminster Hall until 1685. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.